In this episode, we're going to continue using test and commit or revert. Hi, I'm Mark Bradley and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast in which we use live coding to demonstrate different types of testing tools and techniques. In this video, we're going to complete Tom Oram's Untangling Conditionals Kata. This is a really nice refactoring code kata I tried a couple of weeks ago. And whilst doing it, I thought it would be really good to try using it with test, commit and revert. Let's look at the code. In the previous video, I introduced you to the concept of test and commit or revert, and we implemented FizzBuzz using the technique. A few weeks ago, I was trying to complete the Untangling Conditionals code kata and got stuck, and my test failed, and I had to work out where to revert back to. And I was thinking that this kind of code kata would be a really good way to practice not only untangling and conditionals and refactoring, but also a way to test using test and commit or revert. Because that's really what you want to do when you're refactoring this kind of code, is make a small change, run the tests, commit, move on, make another change, and commit and move on. So that's what we're going to try and do tonight. We're going to try and refactor the code to make it cleaner and more readable. Before we start doing any refactoring though, let's turn on the limited work in progress plugin we used in the last video. So again, we're going to use the TCR mode. So we'll enable it, and because we want to track each small change we make, we will use the open commit dialog option, and we'll write a commit message each time. We don't want to notify when we revert, and we don't want to revert tests because we won't be changing any of the tests. So now let's get on with looking at the code. Tom's repository for this kata provides the code to be refactored. He's implemented it already in a number of languages, so if Go's not your thing, have a look and see if there's a language that you do use. I'll add a link to the bottom of the video. Although there are a lot of files in this kata, the only one we're really interested in is the pipeline and the tests that ensure the pipeline is working. The idea of this kata is to take these nested conditionals and turn this code into something much more readable, much more easier to understand the flow and what's going on and what's going to happen as you go through the code. Before we start, let's just check that the plugin is working. So we'll just make a change or break, run our tests, tests fail, and our code's been reverted. So now let's make a start on refactoring our code. The code that we are refactoring is creating a basic pipeline for testing and deploying an application. We are passed in a project, we run the project's tests, and depending on the success or failure of those tests, we do certain things. And then if the tests pass, we then try to deploy the project. And again, if that's successful, we do a different number of things. And then we move on. So the final part of the pipeline is, once everything's completed, we email out what happened during the testing and deployment phase of the pipeline. So let's make a start. During this video, I'm going to make quite a lot of use of the refactoring tools provided by IntelliJ. I will try to let you know which shortcuts I'm using as I use them. The first refactor I'm going to make, I'm just going to extract out all of the test running code into its own method. So let's start with that. So I'll highlight the piece of code I want to extract, and I'm going to use on a Mac Option Command and M. And I have two options here. I can either extract it to within the pipeline or just its own function, and I'm going to keep it within the pipeline. I want this function to be private, so I'll keep the start of the name lowercase. So we will call it run tests. Okay. So run tests at the moment takes a project, passes in test passed, and returns test passed. Let's save that. Go down and look at what it did to the code here. So it passes in test passed and returns it. If it's because it can be changed. Okay. Let's run that test. See what happens. Cool. So test passed and the commit dialog's opened. So we'll just explain what we did. So we extracted test running to its own function. Commit. Brilliant. So there's our first refactor done. So the next one we can do is, rather than pass in false, we could make a refactor to not pass that in. Take that out. So that'd be new. Okay. So another tiny change again. So we've taken the test passed variable from the main function into this test run function, and then we just return it at the end. So we basically move the defaulting into the test run function, the run test function. Let's run the tests and see what happens. Another refactor that worked, so we will say moving the default value for run tests, tests passed into the run tests function. Now let's carry on with our refactoring. So we now have this run test function, and that's quite neat. So let's go back up and look at the run function. So this seems like an opportunity now to move deploy into its own function as well. So again, we'll extract that using Option Command and M to extract to method, and we'll call that deploy. Private, sorry, so deploy. So we've made that small change. Let's run the tests, and we'll say we are extracting the deploy function, deploy code to its own function. Yeah, and we'll commit. Looking at it again, we've got this defaulting of the value happening outside of the deploy function, so we'll move the defaulting inside the deploy function. So here, and we can remove that. And there we are. So now we've moved that defaulting in, we'll run the test again. Yep, that passed. So we are the default value of deploy successful into the deploy function. Commit. Okay. Ah, well, that's interesting. That passed. Oh, no tests were run. Okay, so that's an interesting problem we found. Is if the tests don't run, it seems to open it up. So actually, there we go. Do that so the tests actually pass. Okay, there we go. So commit that again. That's better. So in the last video, we found that if the tests don't run, nothing gets reverted. So if there's a compile error, the tests don't get reverted. But it's actually useful to know actually if the tests don't run at all, it seems to still commit. So something to bear in mind if you're going to start using the limited work in progress plugin. So we've now moved it into two functions that makes it quite clear. So we've run tests and test passed is returned, and we deploy and deploy successful is returned. So the next thing we can do is we can do another extraction and take the emailing out. So Option, Command, and M again. We can call this notify. Okay, that looks good. Let's run the tests. We are extracting the notification code. Commit. So although we have a nice clean run function now that has 3 simple steps in it, once you step down into each of those functions, the code is quite messy, and we really want to start cleaning up that nested conditional logic. So let's make a start on the run tests and cleaning that up. Okay, let's get it all on the screen. So what we can do first is we can take this if here, and if we flip the test to say instead of if has tests, we say it does not have tests, then we can put a guard statement at the top of our function and return early. So let's make a start on doing that. So if not project has tests, then we can take this else. What happens in the else? And instead of setting tests passed to true, we can just return true. And then remove this else. And now because we're returning early, we can also remove this if. So that's the first step in cleaning up the code in this run tests. Let's actually run our tests and see if our refactor works. So those tests passed. So let's commit. So what did we do here? We removed the first level of conditionals by creating a guard statement for no tests. Okay, commit. So now let's move on and continue to look at this and see if we can improve it anymore. If we continue with this return early way of working, we can remove this variable and just return in each of these cases. So let's do that next. Here we want to return true, and here we want to return false. Okay. Now making this variable and this return statement redundant, so we can remove those. Okay, we'll run our test and see where we're at. That worked. Removing test pass variable with early returns. So that's looking really nice. We've still got this else, which we want to remove. So what we could do is if we just remove the else, because we've got the early return, realign it. So to realign, I'm using Command Option and L. We've now removed the else from the if, which makes this code look a little neater. Let's check that works. Yep, test are running. So we remove else and rely on early returns. Okay, let's commit that. So that's looking really neat now, and I think that's reasonably clean. So let's now move on to looking at the next part that happens in our run function, and that's deploy. This function, although the functionality is different, looks very similar to our previous function. So we can start with a guard statement at the top. If the test didn't pass, we can just return false. Let's make that happen. If the test didn't pass, return false. There we have it. So this else now disappears. Save that. In fact, this if disappears completely. Let's realign that. There we go. Let's run the tests. They're all passing. Removing first level of conditionals with guard statement. Yeah. Get that E. Okay, commit. Okay. So now we can continue down the same path we did last time. We can remove our variable by doing early returns. So return here, and we return here. And even though I know what I'm doing from the last one, I'm still trying to make those small steps, just in case there's something I've missed in the code that is a little bit different. That happens. The early returns mean I should be able to remove this variable. Run tests. Excellent, that worked. So removing deploy successful. Variable with early returns. Commit that. And then the final thing we can do now is we can remove this else because of the early returns. Command Option L to realign the code. Okay. And run our tests, see if that moves. Excellent. So removing else because of early returns. Okay. So commit. So these two functions, our run and our deploy, now look nice and clean. Okay. Now let's go back and look at our notify function, where the previous functions had two levels of conditional, we now have 3 levels. So we have the first one here, the second one here, and then the third one here. So let's look at how we can tidy this up. Our first one is we've got this config send email summary. So if we switch the conditional here, we can have a guard statement again in this function. So let's do that. So take the functionality of the else. We now say if we're not sending the email summary, then we log, and then we just early return no value. So we've broken out the function. This else can now be removed. And we'll realign, and let's run the test to see if that worked. Remove first level of conditional with another guard statement. Excellent. Commit. Let's go back and look what options we have next. So the next thing we can do here is we could make use of an early return if the tests don't pass. Send the test failed email. Let's make that change. If the tests didn't pass, then we send the email to say that the test failed. Type everything up. Let's run the tests. Okay. Test failed. Why did the test fail? Expected test failed, got deployment failed. Did I muck up the logic there? So if the test didn't, I think it's the early return. I forgot to add that. There we go. I'll do a mistake at the end. Let's try again. So return. That's a bit I forgot last time, I hope. So, there we go. Okay, so we're now doing that. Let's realign everything. Let's run those tests. Switching conditional for passing test and another early return. Okay. If we use another early return here, then we can remove this else. Let's have a look at that test now. So that's looking a little better. So let's run that test and see how we are. Removing final else thanks to early return. So now let's look over all of our code. Our run function is really nice and neat. It's very clear that the first thing we should do is run the tests, and we want to log if the tests pass, and then we want to deploy and pass in whether the tests pass or not. And the final thing we do is once we know whether the test passed and whether the deploy was successful, we want to notify it. And neat and clean. And then we refactored the test run and the deploy function using a very similar pattern. They're looking really clean now. A single early return and the guard statement at the top looks quite neat, and same with deploy, nice and neat. And then we've gone into our notify function. Our notify function still has a lot of ifs in it, which I'm not sure I like that much. So I wonder if we can improve it. But the first thing I want to improve is this log here, and I want to tidy this up. So because the log that it's sending emails happens quite separately from the actual time we send emails. So what I want to do is I want to create a new function called method. We'll just call it send email. And it will take a message, string, and then we'll bring that back to here, and we'll send a message. So we can do that for each of these. And then we can put the logging that we're sending an email right into this function here, like so. And then that's a much neater way of doing it, I think, anyway. So if we run that test, cool. So we're moving, emailing, and logging of emailing to its own function. Apparently no tests will run again. Why is this happening? Test will run. Go commit. Right. Not quite sure what's happening there. Okay. So we've made those changes, but I'm not quite sure. One of the things I don't really like at the moment is the fact that these booleans have to come in and out and in and out. The functions. So I want to change that. At the moment I've got this idea where instead of returning booleans here, maybe what I can start doing is returning an error. Because the only time that false is returned is if the tests fail. If we look at this on the test run, so if the project has no tests, the test runs are fine and we continue to deploy. Whether you do that in real life, I don't know, but that's just the fun of this Kata. So the only time the false is returned is if the test fails. So maybe what we can do is return an error here instead, and we could look at stopping everything happening at this point, because at this point, if we look, we log that the tests fail, and when we notify that the test failed. So the wording's the same. So maybe we could make use of that error and send some emails from there. So let's have a look at that. If we change this interface, so it says it returns an error. So when it's true, it returns nil. And when there's an error, we return error. Errors .new, and we'll bring in the message here. And we'll move the logging out and up to here. So this is now an error. And if error not equal nil, we want to log the error message. So error. Now we need to go back, just for this, for now, we can go back to default setting this to false. And we can move this to test pass here, of course true. Okay, so it looks like we're making the code a little bit scruffy at the moment, but bear with me. I think with my idea should bring us back to much neater code. So save that. So let's run that. Oh, hang on, that needs to be There we are, first time. So if we run that test, yeah, our test passed. So we are starting to use errors when tests fail. Okay. As I previously said, that the error message that's returned here and logged is the same one we send here, test failed. So what we can try and do now is make use of early returns here. We can bring in this. Okay. And we'll use that message, there we go, and we'll return. Now we don't need these because if we get here, the test passed. Save. Okay, and here again, just assume test passed. Let's have a look and see what happens here. Oh, something failed. So we expected test failed, email disabled. Okay. So what's happened here is we missed something. So previously in our notify function, we were checking that if the emails should be sent, we send the emails. But if they can't be sent, if they should be sent, they get sent. But this guard statement only stops at the notify function. Well, we can really quickly actually make a little refactor here to neaten up the notify and remove the guard statement or move the guard statement down to the emailing function. So now at the point we say we send email, we decide whether an email should be sent, and then we log whether it should or shouldn't be sent, and if it should be sent, we also send a message. So that actually makes quite a nice tidy up of the notify function, because now if the tests don't pass and deploy is successful, so this notify function has become immediately a lot tidier. So let's test that refactor first. There we go. Okay, so moving emailing guard logic statement to the emailing function rather than notifying function. Okay. So there we go. So by bringing the concern of emailing into a single function, the notify function has become a lot cleaner. And now the functionality we were going to add previously will work. So p dot send email, and we want to send the error. So hopefully this time this refactor works. And if it does, we should be able to remove this function. And this boolean here. Okay. So now if we run the tests, miss something again. That's my bad. We forgot the early return. That's annoying. So let's try again. Let's put that return in first. Return. Okay, and now we want to send email. So you can see how this way of working encourages you to make a lot smaller changes. So this time I'm actually just going to make this one change, make sure it works, and then I'm going to go and do the cleanup. So if we run that, Right, that's better. So emailing test failure error message and early return. Okay. Oh, the test passed. Oh, so it's probably, yeah, it's warnings, but the about the variable. So let's move on. So we'll just commit that. Okay. So now we can tidy up after ourselves. So let's go through and slowly do that. So we shouldn't leave this variable anymore, so we'll remove that line. And we don't now need to pass in the test passed function, test passed variable into deploy, because we know if we get to deploy, the tests have already passed. So we're going to clean this function up. Like so. Okay. And that's that one tidied up. Now we can move back to here. Oh no, it's a bit high. And again, the notify function. We know if we get to the notify function, the test's already passed. So we don't need to pass it in again. And we don't need to email out if the test failed, because we know we've done that already up here. So let's have a look at that. So the notify function is getting nice and clean, the send email function is nice and clean, and the deploy function is nice and clean, and our run is getting tidier. So let's run the test. Yep, that's brilliant. So cleaning up the test passed variable as it is now not required. Okay, commit that one. I think we can probably make the same refactor to deployment successful. I think we can use an error again. So let's have a look. So we've got error, deployment failed here, and in notify yet deployment failed. Okay, so let's change this up again. So let's change this to return an error. And this now returns nil. And this now returns errors new, deployment failed. No, word return. There we go. So let's go back up the top. Okay, if we want to make a tiny change, we'll set that to true. And then we'll do error equals that. And then same again, just small change. So if error does not equal nil, we want deployment successful to be false. Not anymore. And we want to do the logging that we've removed again. So just that, like so. So hopefully that's a reasonably small change and reasonably straightforward. I don't think we're going to make too many mistakes. Let's run the test and see if we're all good. So starting to use errors in the deploy function. And commit. We know the next step we want to do is to send an email if the error happens and early return. So let's test that out. Emailing and early return for deploy failure. Okay, so still warnings, so that's fine. So that works, but as we know already now, we've got some cleanup to do. So take that, that's no longer needed. So if deployment successful, well, it's always going to be successful now. So you take this down to basically that. Okay. Well, I mean, that function's not really needed anymore, so let's just... Well, actually, no, let's just rename it. That's probably a bit cleaner, isn't it? So Shift F6 to notify successful deployment. There we go. Really nice and clean now. So we've removed that Boolean variable, so let's run our tests. Everything's passing, so removing deploy successful Boolean. Okay, commit. And now our code is really looking neat. But what we do definitely have here is some duplication. We can move this into a function. Okay. And let's call it handle error. Okay. Do the same here. Save. Let's run that test. Cool. Removing error handling handling code duplication. Can't spell today, sorry. Duplication. Oh. Thank you. Let's have a final look over our code, see if we're happy with it. So our run function, although we had it quite clean and neat and down to 3 lines, I think this is a lot clearer what's going on. We handle these errors and removed a lot of duplication. Our notify function has now basically become a function that just notifies of success. And our send email function, we've moved all of the information about whether an email should be sent and what should be sent into one function. And now we've got our deploy functions and our run test function. I think there's one thing that I don't quite like about these two functions, and it's the fact that it's kind of the last thing we do is return an error. Now I'd rather the last thing we do be return nil. One by one, we'll flip the logic so that we return nil and our error case sits in the middle rather than the last thing we do. I think that'd be a little bit nicer. So let's do that. So if we look at our run tests, so it either returns passing or it returns failure. So we can just use failure. So if failure, there we go. So we can remove that. Okay. So I think that's a lot neater. I think looking for the failure case is going to be a lot nicer way to do it. So let's run that. Okay, switching logic and returning error earlier. Okay, so that's quite nice. Now I reckon we can improve this if here a little bit as well. So what about if we extract this into its own method again, and we can do something like if tests fail, test run fails. There we go. So that's looking a bit better. Let's run tests on that. Yep, moving test logic into function. Okay, and we can again do the same here. So we can switch this over. So deploy also says failure. So if we've got a failure, and just switch these around. Okay, again, nice. I think that looks a lot neater. Run tests. So switching logic and returning the error. Earlier. Okay, and then let's do the same here. That deploy failed. Okay, run the tests. So moving logic into a function. Commit. So that's our finished code. So there were a lot more functions, but kind of as you can see what should happen basically. So you should run the test. If there's an error, you handle the error and you return, and then basically saying if there's a test error, a test run failure, stop doing whatever you're doing. It's quite clear. Then you move on to deploy. If you deploy and there's a deploy failure, notify the failure and stop what you're doing. Finally, if everything's successful, you notify of a successful deployment. Now, if you're interested in what happens during a test run, or if you're interested in what happens during a deploy, you can dive down into those functions. But hopefully you can see what's happening at a high level, and you can, if you've got to change the way deploy or test run works, you only have to dive into the bit you're interested in. So hopefully you've enjoyed watching me refactor this code, and you can see how using the test commit revert pattern really encouraged me to make smaller changes. And you can see when one of my refactors broke the build and broke the tests, it forced me back into a pattern of much smaller ways of changing, because a lot of the failures were happening when I was trying to make a bigger set of changes rather than trying to make a smaller change and make leave some messy code around it. I was trying to kind of refactor and tidy up everything rather than make the change and then do the tidy up, which I think made it a lot clearer, and I didn't get too far and I didn't find I'd made a mistake too late. I hope you enjoyed this video on test and commit or revert, and I'll catch you again soon. Thank you for watching this episode of Testing All the Things. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the video and subscribe to the channel. If you did not and you have any feedback, please leave a comment in the comment section of the video or contact me on Twitter @Bradle.